Okay, there we go. So let's kick off. So I'm going to start sharing. I am going to demo stuff, but I hope you will bear with me because I did put some slides together that I want to go through quickly, fairly quick, even though there's a lot of them, because I think it's helpful to have some context. And Mel, I just requested to share. All right, thank you. So I think there's a little bit of context that's helpful because, right now everybody sort of thinks of AI because of ChatGPT, right? But there's actually a long history. And so, very briefly, I am a trained applied anthropologist. I work as an AI product manager. I work at CMS. I'm, of course, not representing the government today. I also teach at UPenn, multiple books, articles, all those things. So based on what I just said, I figured I'd set like a little bit of context for you about anthropology and AI because it's actually much richer than people realize. Then get into the live demos showing you sort of like chatbots, which I know most people are interested in, and then sort of pointing to a future direction. And one of the reasons I want to take a little bit of time to set this context is that I believe, now people would challenge me, but working in the industry and seeing how we're already impacting work and using these tools myself, like in my anthropological work, I am a firm believer that this is going to change everything sort of about the way anthropology is practiced, is taught. And I expect that in many ways, anthropology doesn't look very similar in the future than it does today. I mean, there'll be a lot of similarities, but there's going to be great differences as well. And importantly, there are so few jobs in academia that students need to get trained to work right in industry these days, whether that's for profit, nonprofit, government, whatever it is. And those jobs are already looking different. They look different in 3 years. I've even my own work, my colleagues, there's just already a lot of downward pressure to use AI instead of paying humans to do maybe arguably better work, but expensive, costly, timely work, right? So, very quickly, and again, I'm going to go through some of these brief, but I'm gladly send these to you. The point here is I'm giving you like sort of a roadmap so that you could go do some additional homework should you wish after. And I've like included images along the way of like, relevant books or other things. It's not an exhaustive lit review. We have one of those coming out very briefly. I'll mention that in just a slide or two, but
Will you share this recording with us? The
happy to. Yeah.
recording, because this is super useful and our colleagues may want to see this.
Yeah, this
This is great.
already
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if
Happy to do so.
that would be wonderful.
Yeah, more than happy to do so. So, again, I'm going to go through this stuff kind of brief because I do want to get into demos, but like the term AI comes from a 1956 conference at Dartmouth. Still a long history before that, of course, all the way going back to sort of like the loom of how like, computing comes to be. Of course, like Turing is important in this period. But, as much as there was movement in the 50s, 60s, 70s, there just wasn't a lot of computational power. There wasn't a lot of data. Nevertheless, so it's sort of held back for a fairly long time. In the 80s, you start getting expert systems and you start getting anthropologists working in this space at that time. I'll touch on that in a second, but you get expert systems, which is like a positivist way of sort of trying to map knowledge and then have um, systems follow essentially like kind of decision trees to mimic reasoning. They failed for a lot of reasons, again, including like computational power, the sort of challenges of modeling knowledge in that way. Fast forward, we enter what we call an AI winter. Fast forward, and deep learning starts sort of taking off in the 2010s, but particularly with with ImageNet in AlexNet in 2012, um, which basically starts to set us on the path for today. Now, I should be clear that since the 50s and 60s, I would argue there's two major branches, symbolic AI and neural nets. They've always been present. Expert systems are symbolic AI. Deep learning is grounded in what we call neural network architectures. So they've always been present, but from like 2010s on, neural nets have kind of taken over. And in 2017, there is now a very famous article called Attention is All You Need, which created something known as the transformer architecture, which is what ChatGPT is grounded in. And in ChatGPT didn't just emerge onto the scene out of nowhere, of course. It goes back to that 2017 paper and builds on everything that came before it. And importantly, ChatGPT was actually OpenAI. That's the company that produced it. That was actually their version 3.5 of their GPT model, right? So even as an organization, they didn't emerge out of nowhere. Um, and folks like myself in tech were using earlier models prior to ChatGPT coming out from the same company. Nevertheless, it comes out, becomes the fastest growing tech product, reaching 100 million users in 2 months. At this point, you have 800 million users on a weekly active basis, active users on a weekly basis, right? So really substantial. Now, interesting, maybe more interesting to the crowd, is the relationship of Anthro and AI. And we have a book coming out on December 9th or 12th titled Anthropology and AI. And we go through like sort of like an STS history of how anthropology was engaging with AI all along the way, going back to before that Dartmouth conference when people like Mead were involved in the Macy conferences as part of the cybernetics movement, which arguably predates AI, and like many of those ideas become what is AI. In the 1960s, Delheim has a book about using computing in AI, using computing in anthropology, particularly with a linguistic flair. But in between like the 60s and the 80s or 90s, there's actually a lot of interesting developments, like from a methodological perspective, using mostly expert systems, but to look at kinship, to look at like the patterns of tabla drumming from India, all kinds of actually really interesting work that was happening. Then in the 80s and 90s, you get Suchman, and I've actually never looked up Diana. I don't know if it's Forsyth or Forsyth. I never actually went to hear somebody say it, so forgive me for that. I one of these days need to find a YouTube video where somebody pronounces her name. Nevertheless, for me, they sort of set like the modern foundation of what it means to sort of bridge these disciplines. And they do work in that period that still today carries through, resonates, and is very important to what we do, which I'll touch on more briefly in just a second. Then an opinionated view, for me, we go into sort of an AI anthropology winner from the 2000s to the 2017s, not because the work was unimportant, just because it becomes only focused sort of from a critical perspective and no longer is like using the critical perspective to help build products, to help shape the direction of AI. In many ways, it's kind of critique from a distance that arguably for people like myself working in tech the whole time made very little impact as opposed to some of the earlier work or the work that's happening now. Important work to read, important work to teach, but not really as impactful outside of our discipline. And then since 2018, you have this sort of really robust bit of work happening, primarily coming out of like places like, well, mostly Denmark, with the Tant Lab at Aalborg University and the social data science program at University of Copenhagen. You're getting organizations like Epic, where 2018 there was a lot of articles from the conference proceedings on how anthropologists are engaging with AI, not just studying it, but building it and a little bit using it methodologically. The theme of Epic this past year was intelligences, so we're going to get a lot more from those proceedings. I'm publishing on it. There's a number of people who are now publishing. And so the way I typically frame this is you can chunk all of this work into sort of three major buckets. There's like studying AI, most of which is, rightly so from a critical perspective. And these three names I list here are not the only three, but those are three big folks who, have done a lot of work in this space. They've taken up a lot of the sort of volume of publishing. All great, scholars to look into. If you look at their lit reviews, and refs, you can go deeper. I have work in this space as well, of course, where I critically study recommender systems, but these are three big names. Then using AI, and by that I mean like sort of using it methodologically. And again, for me, this goes back to the Tant Lab at Aalborg University, the technoanthropology program, and the SODAS program, which is the social data science program at the University of Copenhagen. They're the most interesting, for me, the most interesting anthropological work is coming out of those two schools. And a lot of what I do today builds on, what I could discern from all of their papers. They themselves build on, the digital methods work that has been happening, over the past 20-ish years. I'll touch on that in just a second. But, some really great work to look into, particularly I should say, Honest Christian Monk is I guess the true pronunciation. has done really fantastic stuff. I'm a very large fan of his work. Then there's the sort of building portion. I would make the argument that there's a lot less in this space. There was a little bit in the 80s and 90s. There's a little bit through the 2000s, but it's not published on a lot. I don't think that's because there wasn't, well, I know it's not because there was a lack of work happening. There was a lot of people like Melissa Sefkin here, who's that third bullet or second bullet, who was doing wonderful work. Dawn Nafis, many people at, say, Intel and Microsoft, and you name it, right? Like a lot of the folks who started the Epic conference, they were doing really influential work. Not all of it AI, of course, many of it just anthropologists in tech. Um, but some of it was AI related. And my hunch is most of it never came to light because of NDAs and intellectual property and just all the normal reasons that they can't talk about it. But then since 2022, I've been publishing a lot in this space, and my work touches all three of these areas for an important reason I'm about to say. But by mid next year, given academic publishing timelines, I'll have about 23 pieces out, all focused on the intersection of AI and anthropology, all intentionally trying to expose like kind of how I do the work, how you can build these things, with the goal being that, again, I really believe, based on experience in the field, that this is going to change what we do. And because I was always in a position where I started an organization, whether as a founder or a co-founder, I was able to just write about my work. So I've been trying to get out as much as possible to show how it's done. And for me, part of that is thinking about how all of these three sort of avenues work together, right? So we study AI, the anthropology of AI, anthropology by AI, which is like using AI methodologically to do our work, which is initially what Mel asked about. But again, I feel kind of compelled to put it in context. And then I think importantly, very importantly, in fact, anthropology for AI, because I don't think we should necessarily just be building AI on behalf of, companies which are quite powerful just to their benefit. More so, I feel we need to get involved and build it because it is very plausible we will have the next social media moment with AI, right? Like there was critical scholars speaking from afar about the dangers of social media. Frankly, none of the tech companies listen to any of that. And arguably, you could say like Meta has become more emboldened over the years because they do things and they get away with it. And we now know there are problems with democracy, with images of self among young people, causing anxiety, depression, right? A whole host of issues, more that I could ever get into today. And so I think it compels us to say we need to sort of move beyond all of critical distance and also, embrace critical proximity, get involved, train people to get in there and build it so that to the best of our ability, with whatever power we have, we can shape it. And so I put forward in some forthcoming work this anthropology AI life cycle where I talk about the relationship of all these together and how we can try and make a difference. Now, I'm going to get to the point of what Mel asked about was the more methodological component, that more middle piece. But I think it's interesting to set that up with a quote from Claude Levi-Strauss, where he says, the fundamental requirement is of anthropology is that we begin with a personal relation and end with a personal experience, but in between, there's plenty of room for computers. And that comes out of that Dale Hymes book from the 1965, where it's on the use of computers, primarily in linguistic anthropology, but arguably we can apply that to many fields today. And to me, I take that as the opportunity to dig in methodologically, and that it's not just, as I will try to demonstrate, it's not just giving, offloading the work. It's not just taking a positivist approach. In fact, much of like my work and particularly I'm learning from the Tant Lab work is all about using this technology to force you to slow down, to think deeply about your kind of conventionally gathered ethnographic material and really challenge us to go deeper, not just actually to go quicker. And so there's a few things maybe worth looking at for you all and students or whomever. But this is actually a new book, Digital Methods. It's out 2025. And they touch on like three major digital paradigms that I think are important to contextualize. So in the beginning, you had sort of the virtual sort of paradigms. And really what that was just taking our traditional methods and sort of going online, like virtual ethnography or netnography. It wasn't a sort of digital native method in any way. And then there's sort of the boom of digital methods, which is like really digital native, the methods grew out of these new environments or newish environments that, and they were methods that didn't exist offline. And so that could be web scraping, that could be like computational text analysis. Obviously, we do text analysis, but computational ways of doing that. Same with network analysis. Obviously, there's histories of mapping kinship and other such things, but there are natively sort of computational ways of doing this today. And then building on those digital methods, I would argue and the book I think would argue as well, right, to a degree that we might phrase it a little bit differently, but there's a clear kind of computational uptick at the moment, which is, based on very large data, very large computational abilities, and very much grounded in AI. And it looks a little bit different than some of the digital methods that came before it, which were much more data science oriented. And the line between data science and AI is a bit blurry, but I would say a little bit more kind of traditional data science oriented, whereas now it's a little bit more kind of AI oriented. So, few terms that are also worth noting for you. Right, AI is this broad field of computing that just tries to mimic human capabilities. That could be reasoning, that could be vision, it could be listening, it could be right, a whole number of things. Large language models are a type of AI model grounded in that transformer architecture paper. And it's like when you hear ChatGPT today or any of the models related to that, we're talking about a large language model, which essentially is trained on the text of the internet. And so it has developed a fairly broad understanding of, human culture, arguably is even creating culture, and, you know, can be incredibly useful to use in your research. Generative AI is builds on top of that to, well, generative AI produces content. One way of producing content is text, and large language models thus contribute to generative AI, particularly for generating text or understanding text in the process. But there are others. So, when an image is generated, it's technically not a large language model, it's a diffusion model. Nevertheless, anything that's generating sort of output in this way is what we call generative AI. And then chatbots like ChatGPT are, the tools that stack on top of what I just said. So they generate content and they stack on top of large language models or image diffusion models to give you an easy to use interface that you converse with. So it's conversational, and you direct it through natural language prompts, which could be questions or directives. And in turn, it responds to you, right, with an output that is meant to satisfy your need. So the opportunities of chatbots in your work or in teaching, whatever it may be, is like, it does offer a great deal of accessibility. They are no code tools, right? You just type in natural language. So they're fairly easy to use. They can help you augment your work, um, in that you can ask it to do certain tasks for you and it will help you with that. And it gives you something back to review. They are multimodal, so they can take a range of inputs, which is pretty interesting, and I'm going to demo that in just a second. And they are multilingual. Of course, not every single language on the planet, right? But many of of course, all of like the very large language. Just now, of course, there's an argument to be made here that they're not representative of all languages around the world, and maybe they should be, maybe they shouldn't be for a whole host of reasons. Nevertheless, right? For at least these reasons, they can be very useful for you to help you hopefully not offload your work, but speed up various aspects of your work and help you do a few things that you could not do before, like data science work. The challenge with this is that you really have no idea what's happening. Now, that is also true of large language models, but there is a sort of a way to help make things a little bit more transparent, which I'll touch on in just a second. But a chatbot, and even an LLM more broadly, they have a context limit. And by context, we speak in terms of tokens, which isn't exactly a word, but usually in many words, there's going to be one or more tokens, depends on the size of the word. Well, there's always one, right? But there's usually more depending on the size of the word and how we chunk it up. But they have a certain amount that they can handle, right? So you can't dump in the entire anthropological corpus and expect that it can work with it. You could, however, dump in multiple of your own articles or other articles that you're working with, and it will, it handles one better than many, of course, at the moment. But point here is it can handle many articles, and there is a limit, but there is a limit to it. Again, as I sort of just mentioned, though, it's sort of like opaque how all of this happens. There's really no way for you to see any of the conclusions it comes to in a chatbot, at least not today. There are also ethical and sort of data concerns. Like if you're using a free account, it may be training on your account on the data that you put in. So, you certainly would not want to put in anything that is private or sensitive. There's a host of issues there. Even if you have a pro account, you often have to opt out of these things. There's questions of, should you ever put in any kind of like, um, informant information in there, right? Probably ideally you would want to anonymize everything plausible, but sometimes maybe that also impacts the analysis then, right? So there's a host of things to work through there. Long conversation. Happy to maybe respond to questions at the end, but maybe too much just to touch on in this slide. And then there's the sort of problem that, these tools, when companies make these, they're making what we call general purpose tools. They're meant to serve a broad range of needs. They're not meant to be an anthropological tool, though it can do anthropological things. It's not developed specifically to do that. And so there are gaps, there are shortcomings, and you can make the argument that many of these tools, chatbots that are grounded in large language models, will kind of regress to the mean, right? So they are statistical tools. They will have a tendency to sort of not tell you about the edge cases, which sometimes for us is like the really interesting stuff, and tell you more about that center of the bell curve, if you will. That's good and bad in various ways. Um, Nevertheless, there are challenges that you need to be aware of. And this image here is a very simplified version of what we call vector embeddings. And so when you upload text, technically it these tools parse that text into what we call multi-dimensional embedding spaces, or and those multi-dimensional spaces, like, this is showing a few dimensions, but in reality, it could be hundreds, it could be thousands, it could be millions, depending on the model at this point in time. We have no way of visualizing or even conceptualizing that. And they find statistical patterns that we may never ever see as humans, which can be very interesting. But the problem is we also don't necessarily can't really understand the patterns they find because of the black box nature of these models and this opaque reasoning, right? And so at one side, it's interesting. At another side, it's challenging because we can't always explain it. And machine explainability is not, it's developing. It's a field that is developing, but it's not prime time yet, right? We're not completely able to say how all this is happening. So what I would encourage you all is to start with the chatbots, ChatGPT, whatever you're comfortable with. But at some point, we all need to move beyond chatbots, and I would make the argument we need to be teaching students how to move beyond those, because there's a lot that we can do, and again, chatbots are a great place to start, but over time, I would make the pitch that we need to do more. Nevertheless, when we go beyond it, we can start to more appropriately, in my opinion, foster collaboration with these tools, because we can design certain checkpoints where we need to engage and we need to review in ways that really turns it into an interesting collaboration versus just a conversational turn. You ask something, the chatbot gives it back. And that is collaboration. But I would make the argument, and I have papers coming out on this, that there are much more interesting ways of doing this that can foster like epistemic sort of pluralism, where we can almost like replicate a team of researchers from other disciplines when we ourselves may not be experts in that. Right? There's a whole host of things we can do. And again, I have a lot of work coming out on this stuff. I think we can also make them more anthropologically aware through a number of things, fine-tuning models, building custom tools, just making sure we're passing in data that may not be available elsewhere. And when we do this in custom ways using APIs, we can preserve privacy. Um, I think based on what I'm saying, there's an argument to be made here that we can go a little bit deeper methodologically. We can do very interesting things, like a chatbot does not code data and do thematic analysis the way we would teach students to do it. But you can sort of replicate that, and I have, right, by building custom software. So I think there's a huge opportunity for us to shape these tools, right? To put our sort of uh, to create our own so that we have tools that benefit us, benefit our work, but also help us as a act as a counter to sort of the large tech companies and what they're doing. Or ideally, we get in the tech companies, as I'm arguing, right, and we shape them in similar ways. And I have an article. There is a link here again. I can share this all, but this was in 2023 where I was basically saying I think there are a number of things that are going to happen in the coming years based on the trajectory I was seeing. One of those was automated digital ethnography, which is technically what Mel reached out about. And to me, that is like the automating of it. I don't mean completely automating and giving it away. I mean automating aspects of it, but while keeping us involved. One of the points I make in the article is that this is going to touch all fields, but the goal should be human AI collaboration, not replacement. And I do believe that that is achievable. And the tools I've created, which I will show today, do that. Also, knowledge graphs, which gets back to some like symbolic AI. There is a very, and I know this from practice and in my work, there's an opportunity to actually use the old symbolic AI model to ground neural nets, which again are these unexplainable black boxes. When you do that, you can make sure that they are grounded in an anthropological knowledge, right? So there's a lot of opportunity there. And all of this speaks to then building custom tools. And so I have started just putting out what I call the AI anthropology toolkit. It's a few tools. There's a link to my GitHub page where one is for building a code book from like, whatever literature you have. One is to chunk, like say, interview transcripts. So instead of just like breaking it up by paragraph or something, it breaks it up by semantic chunks, trying to preserve meaning. And then the sort of thematic analysis one, which is really about it does both deductive coding and inductive coding and iterative loops. Of course, sort of looks for overlaps, kind of cleans up codes along the way, builds those up into themes, and I'll show off some of that data. And so that's the presentation. I know you wanted to see demos, and I'm going to jump into that, but I did want to sort of set that context because I actually, for me, I think it's very important to be thinking about this more holistically. Um, I was curious now. Well, let me just pause there. Any questions, comments?
Boy, that's a lot to think about. It's very helpful. Hi, Matt. I'm Rudy Colorado. I'm a cultural anthropologist. I've worked for 30 years with indigenous communities in the Andes, and last summer we did a oral history project, and we have um, 80 recordings which we're transcribing, and I'm talking to colleagues in the School of Data Science about trying to use these this Quechua material to train a language model. Yeah, I have no background in this whatsoever, but the basic idea of a Quechua intelligence that's made possible through not just our own recordings, but now looking around to see other people with other corpuses. So that's on my mind as well as, of course, what I need to be teaching my students. So I'm really grateful for the kind of, the context you've given us here for all the homework I need to do.
Well,
And
thanks for sharing. The project sounds really interesting. I do hope you do it. There's definitely a lot of opportunities there. It would be really compelling to see come out.
Yeah.
this is Mel. You probably can't see me, but I am really compelled by the Anthros specific AI models. It's an idea that I had the experience of having like organically and originally, but for my own purposes and I love that like it's actually a thing that someone with the skills to make is trying to do so. I don't know if it's able to come up again later in this conversation or in another one. I think maybe many of us would be really interested in that and like in customizing models for
Yeah.
our own research purposes, training it on ethnographic texts or other or not only ethnographic texts.
Well,
So,
historic text too,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So one of the reasons I've been drawn to this, one of the reasons I'm glad to be here today is my research has really started to segue more into historical documents. And compiling those large databases, but then also keeping track of that material. Like from a history perspective, that's usually just supposed to be one person who then specializes in those documents forever and ever. And that I can't do that. But I need to be able to remember it. And then what I've seen, particularly with chatbots and using ChatGPT and even Gemini, is what you mentioned. Like it taps out pretty quickly. Like I can give it so many documents, I can look through so many things, but then it'll stop referencing back. And so thinking about how to build something that helps me collaborate long term with, like almost a research assistant would be really helpful, so that I don't just end up with a project where I'm only focusing on the last month of material that I've now looked at. And so yeah, so I'm very interested as well. So to build on what Mel said.
And if I could add just a question, you don't have to answer it right now, but maybe it could be a follow-up. I'm just curious about the emergence or the potential, do we need to talk to the IRB before we give our de-identified data to an LLM? Should we be even thinking about this? I mean, I know obviously HIPAA, protected information would be a no, you wouldn't do that. But even, if we're starting to use respondent data, what's your experience with the boundaries there, or how to do it safely? I mean, do we just do de-identified data and call it good?
So, I mean, I would definitely somewhat defer to the organizational, if your organization has read anything on paper that dictates that at this point, like say at the IRB level, obviously, right, defer to that. In absence of that, certainly de-identifying, not using a free account ideally, and then making sure your paid account has any sharing or training turned off. In most, as big tech often does, it's an opt-out, not an opt-in. So making sure you go into your settings and are certain that they are not training on it. And unfortunately, keeping up with the news to make sure that they don't ever change the terms of service or change those settings, which, tech has done over the years, and lots of tech companies have done things like that. Um, you know, as the practice matures and as things become even easier, you can be sure, like, it's when you use these models via an API, which I'm going to kind of show off, they are definitely not training on that data because, all private organization, not all private organizations, but, private organizations will almost always use an API for such tasks because, for that reason, right? That's the way to sort of use the model, but you're not quite pulling the model into your organization, but you're using it in such a way where you're really not passing anything to them. So that's, the ideal state from a technical implementation. But yeah, I mean, remove, obviously de-identify it, especially if it's, I mean, HIPAA stuff is out. These models aren't HIPAA compliant yet. PII though, make sure to strip it. And then, after that, what I would say is in the coming years, it will be more capable to run the models on your own computer. There are small models now, and you can use them already. They don't perform as well, but as the models get, as they're designed better, the ability to run increasingly bigger models on personal computers is right. That is a thing that is unfolding. So like OpenAI, they released their open source models at this point about maybe 2-ish months ago. And you can run fairly capable large models on a local computer, like say on a MacBook, which, has some built-in processing that does it quite well. So, there are some short-term things you need to do to take care of it, and there are some long-term things that, somewhat ease the burden a bit. Okay, so we have 20 minutes left. So I was originally going to ask you, like, I was curious to do like a little maybe workshop with you about like how you're using it, but because we only have 20 minutes, I think I'm just going to jump into the demo. But one thing I guess what I was going to do in that workshop was sort of ask you how you are using it today and then maybe try to reflect some of those back. But for the sake of time, let me just do this. I mentioned first that it was multimodal, right? So this is an image I took in Ecuador once. You could there are surprising abilities, right, for even like multimodal analysis in a chatbot. Right? You could ask something like this, and it's probably not going to get this perfectly right, but even you can imagine the reason I'm doing starting with this is one, because I said multimodality, but also vision. I think in chatbots, people often overlook the vision capabilities of these models, right? And so there is a discipline of AI known as computer vision, and the large scale analysis of images or videos is something that's not quite available. Like it's not, you can't do large scale in a chatbot, right? But I'm working on building some stuff in that space to deal with any of my visual material where, you can think of how much, of course, there's a need to analyze text, but you can also, right, we have so much visual material often. And so there is, right, a need to think about how we handle that. Nevertheless, even in a chatbot, right, there is interesting opportunities for working with vision. So don't overlook that. Um, and that can be in a number of ways, right? That could be to try and maybe make sense of something. You could even say something like, pull out all of the, um, what might I want to say?
The guy being all the plants.
It's either Kayaposhi, Peebo, or a Explorer.
Can we just have an ID?
Yeah, the botany is done.
Well, Zohar, I hate to tell you, what for you next?
So that response isn't quite, but the point here, let me just go back up to this, right? Like you can use it to sort of zoom in and make sense of things. And in an automated way, there with computer vision, you can start to pull out, all the aspects of the work. What is it a human, right? Is there a plant, et cetera, et cetera. And imagine building a corpus across all your images of like what is seen in that. And then there's ways to do analysis on that to think about like what shows up frequently. And yes, there are questions about like, understanding human emotions and, and using this sort of image, of somebody who may or may not consent. I get that. I, of course, am paying and they're not training on my data, but like something like that, right? There is opportunity there. Now, so I just want to plant that seed, but thinking about the research life cycle, if you're not already playing with it, you should be considering web search. Now, something like ChatGPT, all the platforms will do web search at this point, right? They wouldn't in the beginning, but if you explicitly tell it to do a web search, it will always kick it off. Sometimes it doesn't know that that's your intent, and you might have to come down like to here, or in the other platforms, it's something similar. But I could say do a web search for anthropologists working in AI, right? And it will give you, a not always perfect response, of course, right? But it will go out, it will take my query, it will decompose that into multiple subqueries, fan out to the internet and pull back information. And so you can think of this as the start of, like the lit review capabilities of a tool like this. Not to replace you actually doing the lit review, but to help you get a jump on something. Like sometimes I've written a statement, right? Maybe that is in a space that I'm not well read in. And I will use either web search or deep research, which I'm going to show off in just a second, to then go out and find me some of the key lit in that area, right? As a quick way to sort of find what I need to go look at, then do a little bit of research elsewhere. There are also tools like Elicit, which is a natural language. Essentially, it's, imagine Google Scholar, but powered by natural language. So instead of a keyword-based approach, it's natural language. So you can type something like, fairly ambiguous, but that is relevant to your cause. And it will understand the intent, behind the natural language and help you find papers that may not be just keyword related, but semantically related, right? And so there's opportunities like that coming, right? So I did a web search here, pulls back some names, right? And then I can start kind of digging in, pulls back links these days, right? And so you can start kind of like doing that. But more importantly, if you're not already using it, the deep research mode, right, is very useful. So So deep research, one of the interesting things about it is it's not just simple agents that go out, right, and query the web and pull back information, but instead what it really is, I mean, it's much more complex agents, but it's what we call agentic AI. And so it will take your task. First, it generally comes back with questions so that it can narrow the scope and be more accurate than just like using your query alone. So it helps rewrite any prompt you put in. And then it fans out much more complex agents that will go out, look at the data, and then synthesize that into a final report. And so if you haven't used it yet, what you will get, and I'm not going to necessarily run it now because it will take a little bit of time, but what you're going to get back, right, is essentially a report that breaks everything down with links to all of the lit and written in a way that is almost like a lit review that you can then dig into. And of course, I'm not telling you to reuse that, right? But that's very, very useful to be thinking about. And this kind of like research capability in these tools is rapidly getting better, right? And it will do fairly good lit reviews that are human-like, probably only within, 18, 24 months. I mean, they're already pretty good. They still miss some things, but humans miss some things anyway, right? We're all not, we don't always catch everything we need to catch. So don't overlook those two, again, as sort of simple capabilities. The changing of models up here, very, very useful, as is, selecting, advanced features. Most people don't use those, but they are very useful. This up here, like in ChatGPT, and it would be different between each tool. It tries to understand what you need to do and pick the right model. But a thinking model, what it does is it helps reason over your data. And so it will produce some output. It will sort of like reflect on that oftentimes and go through iterative loops to produce the best output. Yeah, question?
No.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. It is actually very helpful. But just like as you were walking us through these tools, I had a question that is related to this concept of AI hallucinations. And actually, so one of like the thing that I started thinking about was, so like say you are doing an AI assisted research on a topic that is relatively new to you because you are kind of like trying to figure out your new research project or something in that area, kind of like what would be your tips on kind of like trying to catch AI hallucinations when you're kind of like trying to get your feet wet in a relatively new area for research where you kind of like don't know a lot about yet?
So what's important to note there is one, that the models obviously do hallucinate. They will hallucinate on they're more likely to hallucinate when the body of knowledge is less well, certainly when there's less training material in the process, and usually there is less training material when that training material is either new, right? Or people haven't published on a lot or is behind paywalls. The more it sees of something, the more likely it is to get right. But in all cases, you still need to check. Now, what is like a better scenario is like if you upload a document at a time, you upload all the content of that text into its context window. And when you ask questions about one document in that scenario, such as like a paper maybe that you're working with, it's likely going to do a very good job of getting all of that right and not hallucinate. There would be word choice differences that you would probably make, but it's probably going to do very well. I find with my own research, if I was to upload one of my papers, it does great. If I upload 15 of my papers, it starts to kind of miss some of the threads and like kind of confuse things between them a little bit. But uploading content, bringing content to the tool is one helpful way of reducing hallucinations without a doubt. When you do web searches, that's another way where it goes out and it pulls back information, but that still relies that the internet is correct or has the right information out there in some sense. Nevertheless, they can occur across the board. You should always check the work still, right? There's no doubt about that. And at the moment, there is no way to completely reduce them because they're part of the design. We call they're stochastic or probabilistic, right? They are grounded on stats. They are not deterministic systems. In an old software application like Word, you go up to the file menu, you click print, it's deterministic. It's always going to print. This is not like that. It's all stats based. So you're getting the most probable answer. And sometimes those are wrong depending on training data and a few other things that can happen. So just check the work because it's not perfect yet. However, again, when you upload it, you get closer and closer. And there is ways, and I'm about to show it, to do some aspects of data analysis that are going to be deterministic. So I could upload this spreadsheet and just say, analyze this. And this is 100 tweets that, I scraped off the internet. I still need to do something with this. It's one of those papers I haven't quite got to yet. There's 40,000 or 50,000 tweets or something. Right. But I could say, analyze this. It's going to look at the spreadsheet. I'm in thinking mode. You can see it's now starting to write code. And in my settings, I make sure it always shows me what it's writing so I can see. So it's installing a whole bunch of Python packages. And now, because it's using Python, it is going to deterministically walk through steps to do something. Now, the reason I just said and analyze this is because I was intentionally trying to show you how if you use a broad, unspecific prompt, these tools don't do as well. They'll try to satisfy your need. They'll try to figure out what they should do. But, I gave it a spreadsheet with, I don't know, 10 columns with a whole bunch of data, 100 rows. And, it's trying to figure out what should it do, right? So it's looking right now at top hashtags, top mentions of other users, et cetera, right? And it's just trying to make sense of it. The key is trying to use prompts that are as structured as possible and as detailed as possible. So we're going to let this finish, and I'm going to step it up and show you just something slightly more detailed. So I'm going to paste in a prompt like this, right, which I'm just going to scroll through it for the second, but I'm basically telling it that I wanted to do topic modeling, and I wanted to do it in a very specific way. I wanted to choose between certain algorithms that I want. I wanted to generate 5 to 7 plausible topic clusters from the tweets, right? And so I'm being very, very clear on how the type of analysis I wanted to do. And if you do that, these tools will do a very good job. And this is why you want to put in some time to studying data science at this point, because you need to know the questions you want to ask, right? So you need to know the methods that exist out there. And then using these tools, they can do a very good job of basically doing some work for you, right? And so let's see what it came back with. Let me just pull that into the browser for a second. This, just as an example, it produced an image. So yeah, that's not the most compelling image. I'm sure there's some others that are better, right? But the point here is it did a whole bunch of things. So top hashtags, top mentions. But if I gave it this tweet and told it to do topic modeling, it's going to do something very specific. For the sake of time, I'm not downloading all those sheets. Some of them may be valuable, but the point is, because I didn't tell it what I really wanted out of it, it just did anything. Let me open up another. I'm going to come back to that because it's going to process for a second. I want to show you another example here. I could dump in, let me grab one of my papers. I could say something like, tell me about the concepts in this paper. Again, fairly broad. It's going to do its thing. It's going to bring back a whole bunch of ideas, print them on the screen. But then the next thing I'm going to kick off here is an example where imagine you wanted to create a code book, right, out of literature. You could upload a couple documents. And yes, you could say, just give me a code book, right? But I'm going to put in this prompt here, which is going to ask for a code book. I'm giving it a role. It's helpful to give these things a role. You're going to play a qualitative researcher, right, with experience in thematic analysis. I'm telling it its task. I'm giving it some context of what I want. I'm telling it the exact process that I want. And it's not going to do it like we do it, but as a thinking model, right? Remember, I'm on a reasoning model up here. It will sort of go through multiple iterations in its own way, and however it sort of chooses to do that. It's not going to be quite a deductive and inductive path the way we would think of that. And I'm basically going to tell it the output that I want. So, right, if I use a vague prompt like this, I get back some text on the screen, right? It pulls out some things, pulls out my framework for code becoming with AI, which is this sort of idea that together we're sort of constantly sort of, evolving together. And there are ways to design for that in systems that we build. But now I'm going to give it this complex prompt. And again, I'm going to let it run, do its thing. I'm going to come back to this previous chat. So you'll see here again, I had given it that topic modeling prompt. So now it kicked off, right? Python tooling based on exactly what I wanted it to do. And, it's trying to run some code, ran into an error here, so it starts again. And let's just scroll down and get to the end. So it's pulling out, wrote a lot of code to achieve this. In an ideal world, you'd review all that code and make sure it's doing what you want, right? But now it's pulled out my topics. So these are tweets from anthropologists that tag hashtag anthropology, academic workflow, assignments, methods, and class talk, decolonization and critical anthropology, care, kinship, and everyday ethics, right? So these are the things that are being discussed. These broad topics are being discussed in that subset of tweets that I gave it. Right. And there'd be ways to advance this. I could ask to visualize this in various ways. There's a whole, it's a deep rabbit hole here. We got 4 minutes left. So let me just quickly pivot. I told you that I think there's more opportunity to build tools. So on GitHub, and I have that link in here, I have, multiple tools where I've built a codebook generator that I can give it a whole bunch, and it loops through in a way that's unlike a chatbot. And it builds up a code book that gets exported as a spreadsheet with what the code is, how it's defined, examples of it, how it should show up in the text, because LMs like examples. I have this tool that chunks transcripts, and I have my coding and thematic analysis tool. And what those look like in practice is code, right? They don't look pretty. I'm just going to scroll. I know you're going to have a hard time following, right? But it looks like this. But they are very sort of elaborate custom implementations that mean to mimic us. So instead of, you uploading like respondent information and it looking at all of that text and sort of just coming back to you with sort of themes, if you will, what it literally does is, like, again, I chunk the interview transcripts. And then I loop through chunk by chunk, first going deductively using the code book that I built. And there's a process of cleaning those up. Then I go inductively looking for more latent themes, clean those up, merge them together, and build those up into topical clusters. And I'm going to stop sharing for a second because I'm going to show you something that I don't want to keep on.